Hello, my name is Jeff Kynard, and today we're going to be talking about converting to year-round greenhouse production and some of the reasons why you might do that and how you would go about it. Before deciding to convert a high tunnel to a greenhouse for longer season extension or even all-year production, many things should be considered. First, realistically evaluate the market and income potential for the off-season produce you are considering producing. Greenhouse crop production varies greatly from field production and therefore requires growers study cultural systems used for greenhouse production of the crops that they're planning on raising. There are also several considerations for how you will heat your greenhouse. You'll also need to consider if supplemental lighting will be required. High tunnels are typically not originally constructed for year-round production, so growers should also think in terms of energy-conserving possibilities that might exist as they go about this transformation. Why would someone be interested in converting a high tunnel into a greenhouse? Well, interest in even longer season extension than that which can be afforded by the high tunnel is increasing for lots of reasons. They can include any of the following. Year-round demand for some types of institutional buyers like nursing homes, hospitals, and others that would like to have fresh produce every month out of the year. In addition to those types of institutions, other institutions have a weighted demand and they would like produce throughout much of the winter with the exception of late December and early January. These would include buyers like elementary and high schools as well as colleges and universities. Additionally, the ability to provide heat allows an insurance policy for growers that are continually pushing the envelope further and further in terms of how early they can plant frost-sensitive vegetables in their current high tunnels. The ability to provide supplemental heat early in the growing season allows for better growth during cold, wet periods often experienced in late March and early April, and it also allows growers to do a much better job controlling humidity levels in the spring and fall growing season. When considering the economics of greenhouse production, numerous land-grant institutions as well as other sources have prepared budgets that can be found by simply using an internet search engine to seek out greenhouse vegetable crop budgets. When looking at these sample budgets, rely on those from places with similar climate. It is likely that greenhouse production budget sheets from southern states will reflect lower heat bills and higher production levels in winter when compared to Illinois, and conversely those from northern states would likely have higher heat bills and lower production levels than what we would experience in Illinois for most vegetable crops. Greenhouses can be heated in a number of different ways. Boilers, hot water heaters, and gas-fired unit heaters are three common choices. They each have advantages and disadvantages. There are also considerations for what type or types of fuel will be utilized. Greenhouses are not normally heated using a ducted central furnace system like in a residential structure. I would also caution that it is common for us to see pollution injury to plants when growers may attempt to use residential ventless propane heaters in their greenhouse operation. The types of heating systems and fuels that will be used need to be decided on a number of factors, including purchase price, installation expenses, as well as yearly operational costs. Proper sizing of heating units can be done in a couple of ways. A Google search of calculating greenhouse heating requirements will provide you with information on how to hand calculate the required BTUs. I personally am not a mathematician, so I do not like to do the math. The same search will also show you where to find calculators where you can enter the parameters for your individual greenhouse, things like the greenhouse style, its size, the glazing material, and other information, and that will determine your required BTUs. As you look through those calculators or start reading about greenhouse heating requirements, it soon becomes evident that there definitely is an impact on heat requirements based on what the glazing material is that is used on your greenhouse. And it is fairly common that growers that may have been using a single layer of poly in their high tunnel, if they go to heating, will likely go to double inflated poly, which offers a much greater energy efficiency. In this slide, you simply see the inflation fan and the tubing that's used as the inlet port to inflate 2 layers of poly so that we have a dead air space, which does provide a significant means of insulation for polyethylene covered greenhouses. There are a number of other considerations on making decisions about heating. One thing you should note, when using unit heaters, if it is determined that 400,000 BTU of heat is required for the greenhouse, this would normally be provided by using 200,000 or 250,000 BTU units rather than an individual 400,000 BTU unit. The 2 units are controlled with a 2-stage thermostat, so that if the primary unit is unable to keep up, then the secondary unit is also utilized. This can potentially result in some energy savings, but more importantly, will hopefully allow growers to maintain temperatures above freezing in the greenhouse, even in the event that one of the units fails. We simply cannot afford to have a zero heat situation in the wintertime when we have plants in the greenhouse. Growers that are utilizing boiler or hot water heat will normally have unit heaters also in place. The size of those unit heaters typically will be smaller than that which would be optimum for heating the greenhouse, but of sufficient size that they can maintain temperatures above freezing even on the coldest night anticipated for the growing region. Additionally, all heating requires electricity for things such as blowers, gas valves, controllers, pumps, etc. So this makes a backup generator a necessity for year-round greenhouse operations. Here's a large 3-bay gutter-connected greenhouse used for vegetable production in southern Illinois. This particular greenhouse is heated with a large outdoor wood boiler that you see here. And one thing we should caution, new EPA regulations, which take effect actually this month of this year, will likely impact price and availability for large boilers like this one. Here you can see the grower who is setting the blower motor so that the fireboxes can be opened so that we can have a look inside, or if you were going to be adding firewood, this is how you go about it. And here we're cracking the door so that we don't wind up with a face full of smoke when the firebox is opened. And here you can see the firebox has been opened and you can see the firewood that is burning inside. This particular unit is actually a dual fuel boiler, meaning that if need be it can also utilize coal in addition to wood as a fuel source. What you're looking at in this slide is the heat exchanger for the wood-fired boiler that we saw in the previous slide. The orange tubing that is visible in this slide is PEX tubing, and that tubing carries warm water from the boiler up to this heat exchanger. There is a fan that blows across the heat exchanger. It's very similar to the radiator in a car or truck or tractor. And as that air moves across the radiator, the temperature of the water is cooled down, and the PEX tubing also returns the cool water from this heat exchanger back to the boiler. In this slide, and I realize it's just the opposite side of what we were looking at earlier, but in this slide you're seeing a propane unit fired heater, or a unit fired propane heater, that is serving simply as a backup. Should something go wrong with the wood boiler, then the grower has propane as a second fuel choice and is still able to keep the greenhouse above freezing. This particular grower also has a tertiary or a third level of backup for heating, and this is a waste oil heater, and we will see these used some in greenhouses. And what you're looking at, this is something that burns when you recycle your motor oil. This is kind of how that stuff can be utilized. And in addition to the waste oil reservoir that you see below this furnace, there is a much larger holding tank outside the greenhouses where he gathers used oil throughout the year, and then in the wintertime can combust it to keep his greenhouses warm. Probably more common for people that are just getting started is to hang a propane fired unit heater like the one that you see right here. This is a self-contained, there's no ducting that goes with this, and it's appropriate and quite serviceable for greenhouse production. It has been used for a long time. Would caution that just taking a furnace from inside of the house and using it as a heat source in a greenhouse tends to be problematic because the residential furnaces are not constructed with heavy enough heat exchangers to survive very long in the high humidity environment that we have in the greenhouse. So you might be able to utilize a residential furnace similar to the way you see this unit heater being used, but in most cases within a couple of years there are cracks and damage to the heat exchanger, which results in you winding up putting combustion gases inside your greenhouse, which can lead to pollution injury or even crop death. One of the things that we worry about, greenhouses, as you're well aware, are very large structures, and so we have concerns about eliminating hot pockets and cold pockets that occur throughout the greenhouse. One of the ways that we address that is through the use of high velocity horizontal air fans, commonly referred to as HAF fans, that are placed inside the greenhouse in such a fashion as to circulate the air so that temperatures remain relatively consistent throughout the greenhouse and we eliminate hot and cold pockets. In large greenhouse structures, in addition to HAF fans, we also might rely on using something called a fan jet or a power tube. And what you can see, if you look at the right hand side of this slide, you'll see there's a large plastic tube that is attached to the blower. It is inflated, and this tube, which you can also see runs the entire length of the greenhouse, is up there in the top of the ceiling on the left hand slide, and this tube allows us to distribute the heated air throughout the entire length of the greenhouse, and this is fairly common in larger structures. Greenhouse concerns quickly change from heating to cooling, even on cold days in the wintertime when we have periods of sunshine. Nearly all greenhouses rely on electrical fans in conjunction with motorized inlet shutters as their first line of cooling. With the onset of summer temperatures, typically sometime in June, additional measures such as whitewash or shade cloth may also be used. Some greenhouses may have fan and pad cooling systems, and it's similar to what is now commonly called a swamp cooler. The fan and pad cooling systems, while they are very nice, they do tend to lose efficiency when we have high ambient relative humidity levels, as is typical in Illinois during the months of July and August. In this slide, in the upper left, you see a ventilation fan, and in the bottom right, you see a motorized inlet shutter. So when the thermostat calls for ventilation to occur, the little motor on the shutter in the right hand slide is activated. That shutter opens up, the fan comes on, and we pull fresh air through the greenhouse. In this slide, you're seeing the greenhouse ranges at the Urbana-Champaign campus that have been whitewashed to help keep greenhouse temperatures cooler in the summertime. In this particular case, you're seeing a glass greenhouse that has been whitewashed, but they do also make whitewash material for use with polyethylene covered greenhouses. The one caution to the use of whitewash is that we would hope that it would be worn off by the time it gets to be fall, and we're wanting the sun's energy to be re-entering the greenhouse at full capacity. It doesn't always work out exactly such that the whitewash dissipates at the time you would like it to. On glass greenhouses, we can simply go up and wash on the glass. That becomes a little bit more difficult to deal with polyethylene greenhouses. This is our greenhouse here at DSAC, and it's been covered with 50% white shade cloth, again to help control summertime temperatures. And the beauty of shade cloth is that when it gets to be September and it's cool, we simply undo the rope that's holding the shade cloth in place, we remove it, and we're back to the same light transmission that we had prior to the application of the shade cloth. And this is a picture of a fan and pad cooling system that is very useful for reducing temperatures inside of the greenhouse, and they work simply through the process of evaporative cooling. Again, when we have low relative humidity outside, these systems work really, really well. When we have high relative humidity, they work a little bit less, they're a little bit less efficient. Supplemental lighting, like you see here, is typically not a component for new greenhouse growers. It's something that as you gain more experience and become competent in the craft of raising plants, then we may want to push them harder through the utilization of supplemental lighting. The HID, or high intensity discharge, or LED, light emitting diode lights that might typically be used in a greenhouse setting are very expensive to purchase. Additionally, the HID lights are also very expensive to operate, and because of that capital expenditure and operating cost, it is not overly common that we would see them utilized in Illinois operations. When we think about raising vegetables in the greenhouse, there are many crops that, although we may commonly raise them in the field in Illinois, they are also good greenhouse crops. As far as which crop is the correct one, selecting the right crop is a function of grower expertise and marketing opportunities. Greenhouse production can be done in beds, very similar to the way we've talked about high tunnel production being done in the past. And the only thing that really changes is the addition of heat, but we are increasingly seeing more and more operations transitioning to hydroponic production systems when they go to a greenhouse setting. Hydroponic systems may offer earlier and larger yields, but that does come at a cost, and that is they do require a higher degree of management, and typically we will have significant additional capital investments for materials and supplies that will have to be made in order to have all of the components for the hydroponic system in place. Simply adding heat to a high tunnel to make it into a greenhouse, one, obviously that allows us to have extra season extension beyond what we could have achieved with simply the high tunnel. But in addition to that, there are some other benefits. The addition of heat allows growers to do a much better job controlling humidity early in the growing season, and this can definitely reduce disease problems that we see early in the growth of the vegetable crops that we're raising. Also, the heat allows for better and more predictable early season growth and early yields. If we have 4 or 5 really cold days in the first part of April, the plants will shut down in the high tunnel. We won't see much growth because we can provide supplemental heat. We can keep those plants trucking right along, and we tend to have earlier yields when we have heat as an option. Like everything in life, it's not all just good. There are some drawbacks associated with that. The addition of heat definitely increases operating expenses. We would hope that this would not necessarily result in a decrease in the profitability of the operation, but it will require additional outlay of capital in order to purchase the heating equipment as well as paying for the fuel. Additionally, the longer the growing season, the more likely it is that growers may have to combat some more traditional greenhouse pests like whiteflies and thrips, which can represent very significant control challenges. And we normally think about greenhouse vegetable production as being a year-round phenomenon, and in some cases it is. I think most commonly in Illinois we would see greenhouses being used to raise tomatoes, and in the case of tomatoes it probably really isn't a year-round phenomenon. Let's go through and kind of look at what happens for a typical greenhouse tomato production cycle in Illinois. Here are some seedlings that the seed was planted December 31st and January the 1st, and here's what those look like on January the 5th. In this case, this greenhouse is going to be raising the tomatoes hydroponically, and so the seeds have been sown into rock wool media that you see here. Here are those same seedlings a week later on January the 12th. And you can see that even though this grower is raising his seedlings in the greenhouse, he's also provided some additional supplemental lighting through the use of T5 fluorescent fixtures to try to combat any stretching that might occur because of overcast days while his seedlings are growing. Here are the same seedlings at this point. These are about 20 days old, and they look really pretty good in quality. They're starting to stretch just a little bit. You can see that the small cube that they were originally sown in, they have been moved up now into a 4-inch Groden block or 4-inch rock wool block to allow for further growth and development prior to them being set out into the greenhouse. Here are those same plants on the 30th of January, and at this point the transplants are a week old, and the grower is moving them up into the Dutch buckets where he will raise them throughout the entire rest of the growing season. And here are those 4-week-old transplants as they've been potted up into their Dutch buckets. What you're looking at here is workers going through the greenhouse with the Dutch buckets that have got the tomato plants in them, and they're going through and placing them in the greenhouse, hooking up the irrigation system, and getting them ready for the growth that will occur throughout the rest of the year. There the growers are hooking up the irrigation lines, and at the same time as they're doing that, they're putting this styrofoam cover in place. That styrofoam cover serves to keep algae from growing on the perlite. It kind of keeps the light from getting to the perlite. If the light can't get to it, then we don't have algae growth. Some growers utilize this styrofoam cover, other growers choose not to. If you look, these Dutch buckets are spaced every 18 inches. There's a bucket, and you can see they go on either other side of the drain line, so as we get a little bit better plant spacing. Each bucket contains 2 plants, and each plant has its very own emitter for irrigation. Those were all pictures that were taken in the course of this growing season. You know, this is kind of what we would anticipate. This is the same grower, and this is what his tomatoes look like on the 28th of June. Again, hydroponic tomatoes in southern Illinois. Here's another. Here are those same tomatoes. Notice the trellis supports that he has manufactured to help hold his crop up in the air. This production system, again, it involves seeding around January 1st, and this grower typically will harvest sometime into September or maybe even to October. The greenhouse is typically left vacant for the months of November and December. This is a common schedule in Illinois, and part of the reason for that is a couple of fold. One, we do tend to see a decline in market for tomatoes in the month of November and December. Additionally, the productivity levels that we achieve off of our tomatoes decline rapidly in the fall as we have waning day length. And so we'll grow them until it starts to get really cold, and we're going to have to invest a lot of money in heat in the fall of the year. And at that point, we simply stop watering the plants, clean the greenhouse out, and let it sit fallow for a couple of months. Hydroponic tomatoes, like you see here, tend to be very high in quality and have much higher grade out of marketable fruit when compared to their field-grown counterparts. In other words, if I go through a greenhouse where we're raising hydroponic tomatoes, if I pick 100 pounds of tomatoes today, I likely have 98 or 99 pounds of marketable fruit. Those of you that have grown tomatoes outside know that if I go out and pick 100 pounds of tomatoes, I may only have 50 or 60 pounds of marketable fruit. So with hydroponic, we tend to have, and the greenhouse environment, we tend to have a much higher percent grade out. It is also potentially a useful tool for growers that are wanting to raise heirloom varieties. We do see that oftentimes we can raise heirloom varieties with far less cracking in the hydroponic system than what we would experience if we were raising them outside in soil. Hydroponic lettuce, like you see here, is likely better suited, at least in Illinois, for true year-round production where we are actually growing things in the greenhouse 12 months out of the year. What you're looking at in this slide is a simple homemade A-frame, and its design is to allow for vertical integration in an attempt to raise more produce per square foot of greenhouse floor space. As we are heating this area, anything we can do to maximize productivity, like vertical integration, tends to be a positive thing. In this slide, you're looking at one of the many different types of commercially available systems for hydroponic plant production. And this is that same system with lettuce that is ready to be harvested. The quality, again, of the lettuce, very similar to the tomatoes, tends to be really good. Consumer acceptance and soon thereafter consumer preference will develop for hydroponic lettuce production. The use of nutrient film technique, sometimes called NFT, in channels or sometimes referred to as gutters, is increasingly common in Illinois. Seedlings are grown in rock wool blocks, as you see on the left-hand side. That block with its seedling is then placed in the hole in the channel lid and grows from seedling to finished product without ever moving it again. And this is just a slide of a commercially available small NFT system. Quite honestly, whether it's four gutters like you see here, or if it's an entire greenhouse, really not much changes in terms of the way the system is designed. We just have more individual troughs that we are dealing with on larger systems. The reservoir in this case is the white tank you see below this table, and it is filled with hydroponic solution. Inside there is also a very small pump which trickles nutrient solution continuously down each trough. As the nutrient solution gets to the low end of the trough, it is then returned back to the tank and recirculated over and over again. Another option for hydroponic lettuce production that we do see in this state is sometimes referred to as raft, R-A-F-T, raft production, or sometimes called deep water hydroponic production. And it represents a fairly cheap way if you'd like to play with some hydroponics and don't have a great deal of experience. This might be something that you might want to consider. And this is an example again of there's a number of different things in there, but mostly you're looking at lettuce being grown in a raft system. And you can see individual plants are grown inside of or grown suspended on this 3/4 inch styrofoam board that's used for insulation. And this system works quite well. And you can see this lettuce is also ready for harvest. So there are a lot of different crops besides the tomatoes and lettuce that we've talked about. But, additionally in Illinois, we might also see growers raising parthenocarpic cucumbers, the very long ones that you see wrapped in grocery stores. Those can be raised quite nicely in greenhouses in Illinois, sometimes referred to as burpless cukes. And we can raise a number of herbs in hydroponic systems inside of greenhouses. And peppers are another choice that we see being raised hydroponically in greenhouses in Illinois. So there are a lot of different choices. I think for most growers, they're going to start out by simply using heat to further push the envelope so that they can start their plants a little bit earlier in their high tunnel. And then as they develop more expertise and their market strengthens, we would likely see them transitioning to some of the hydroponic techniques that we have talked about today. Until next time, this is Jeff. Happy growing. Reach, Mike or myself or Nathan Johanning, feel free to contact any of us with your vegetable questions, and we will be happy to try to answer them in greater detail.